As a result of the Indian-Pakistani War of 1947 to 1948, Kashmir was divided into zones of occupation by the Indian and Pakistani armies. Consequently, the governments of India and Pakistan established civilian administrations in the zones of control, these areas ultimately becoming de facto territories of their respective countries. However, in the years following the war, Pakistan was determined to expel the Indians and annex the whole of Kashmir. By 1965, the Pakistani military high command believed that its forces were ready to wrest the whole territory of Kashmir based on a number of factors. First, as Indian-held Kashmir contained a predominantly Muslim population as did Pakistan, it was thought that Kashmiri Muslims would support a Pakistani invasion. Relatedly, the ongoing civilian protests in the Indian-held region were viewed by Pakistan as the Kashmiris' desire to rebel because of dissatisfaction with Indian rule. Secondly, the Pakistani High Command believed that its forces were in a superior military position as a result of Pakistan recently modernizing its armed forces with large amounts of advanced U.S. weaponry, including tanks, artillery, and warplanes. This military modernization had come about in the years after Pakistan and the United States had signed a Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement in 1954. Thirdly, this military preparedness became evident when in April to July 1965, Pakistani forces had used these advanced American weapons in a series of clashes to seize some Indian border areas in the un-demarcated Rann of Kutch region. Pakistan had launched this limited operation to gauge Indian military capability, and the rather tepid Indian response emboldened Pakistan to hasten its plan on its prized objective, Kashmir. Fourthly, just 3 years earlier, in 1962, Indian forces had performed poorly in a sharp border war with China, which the Pakistani High Command interpreted as a sign of India's military weakness. Following its war with China, India had embarked on a comprehensive military modernization program, and Pakistan sought to provoke a crisis before India had completed its military buildup. Despite all this, Pakistan hoped to avoid a full-scale war with India, but to contain within Kashmir any armed confrontation that should arise. In the summer of 1965, Pakistan made preparations for an infiltration operation into Indian-held Kashmir, aimed at carrying out sabotage and subversive actions aimed at inciting a general uprising against the Indian regional government. Pakistani planners believed that the Indian armed forces, faced with a civilian uprising, would not react militarily against the unrest, which would then allow Pakistan to be in a superior negotiating position if the crisis went to international arbitration. In early August 1965, Pakistan launched its infiltration plan, codenamed Operation Gibraltar. Some 30,000 Pakistani soldiers, posing as Kashmiri civilians, crossed the 1949 ceasefire line into Indian-held Kashmir. There, the infiltrators carried out sabotage and subversive actions but failed to incite a general uprising. Instead, Kashmiri civilians informed the Indian Army, which then sprung into action in the days following, killing or capturing many saboteurs, cutting off their escape routes, and forcing others to flee back to Pakistani-held Kashmir. Indian forces then attacked Pakistani-held Kashmir, seizing the Hajipir Pass and advancing 8 kilometers. Likewise in Kargil, Indian forces subdued the infiltrators and attacked north and seized Pakistani outposts. By the end of August 1965, the arrival of Pakistani army reinforcements stalled further Indian advances. On September 1, 1965, the Pakistani military, concerned with further Indian gains in the north, launched Operation Grand Slam into Jammu with armored and infantry units targeting first Aknur and then Jammu, aimed at cutting India's communications and supply lines to Kashmir. The offensive made good progress initially, but just 1 day later, a command change was made, causing delay and confusion, and allowing the understrength Indian defenses to regroup and reinforce their positions. When the Pakistani offensive resumed on September 3rd, it had lost the element of surprise and thereafter made no more significant gains. More crucially, the Indian Army was ready to launch its own counteroffensives, all aimed at relieving pressure on Kashmir and taking the war to Pakistan itself. On September 6, 1965, Indian forces from Punjab in India crossed the border into Punjab in Pakistan, advancing along 3 axes toward Lahore. That same day, Indian forces crossed the Ichugil Canal and came to within striking distance of Lahore, but withdrew when no reinforcements were immediately forthcoming. Indian forces attacked again, capturing Burki on September 11, 1965, and then Dugrai on September 22, bringing Lahore to within range of artillery fire. However, Indian forces made no further advances. Earlier, on September 8, 1965, Pakistani forces, spearheaded by their elite 1st Armored Division, launched a counterattack, advancing from Kasur and crossing the border into Kemkaran with Amritsar as its final objective. However, the offensive fell into a prepared trap at Asal Uttar, with Indian armor and artillery destroying or capturing nearly 100 Pakistani tanks and stopping the Pakistani advance to Amritsar. On September 7, 1965, one day after opening the Lahore front, Indian forces, spearheaded by the elite 1st Armored Division, crossed into the Sialkot area of Pakistani Punjab. As in the Lahore offensive, the Indian objective here was to relieve pressure on Kashmir and take the war to Pakistan. The Indian advance into Sialkot also threatened the right flank of the Pakistani offensive on Aknur, forcing the Pakistanis to abort this operation. By September 12, Indian tanks had advanced to Philora. Then in a series of engagements in Chawinda on September 14 to 19, 1965, Pakistani air, armor and artillery repulsed repeated Indian attacks, inflicting heavy losses to India's 1st Armored Division. Some limited fighting occurred in the Rajasthan-Sindh border areas, with the Indian objective to tie down Pakistani forces in the region, although the latter had taken a defensive stance. Indian forces advanced into Sindh, capturing Gadra. Since the outbreak of hostilities, the United Nations had issued 2 resolutions to try and force an end to the war, which were unheeded by the warring sides. Then on September 20, 1965, Resolution 211 was passed, which imposed a ceasefire to take effect on September 22 and for both sides to withdraw their forces to pre-war positions. Resolution 211 was accepted by India that same day and Pakistan 3 days later. In the period following, both sides lodged hundreds of ceasefire violations against the other, but no major clashes occurred and the war effectively came to an end. India had agreed to the ceasefire on the mistaken belief that its ammunition stores were running critically low. It soon learned that it had used up just 14% of its ammunition, while Pakistan, which had failed to stockpile and had begun to experience shortages just on the second day of the fighting, had used up 80% of its ammunition. The Indian High Command was also concerned about its heavy loss of armor, although it still held twice the number of tanks as Pakistan. The major powers, particularly the United States and Soviet Union, had also exerted strong diplomatic pressure on the two sides, and immediately at the start of hostilities, the United States, which was the major weapon supplier of India and Pakistan, had cut arms deliveries to both to prevent the war from escalating. Then on January 10, 1966, under mediation by the Soviet Union, India and Pakistan signed the Tashkent Declaration. Both sides complied and withdrew their forces to pre-war positions along the 1949 ceasefire line. Thus, neither side achieved any territorial gains in the war. The war also produced a shift in the Cold War dynamics as India and Pakistan, both heavy importers of weapons from the United States and Britain, which they now considered as unreliable wartime suppliers, turned to the Soviet Union and China, respectively, for their military purchases. India, previously a leading proponent of the non-aligned movement, in 1971 signed a treaty with the Soviet Union and ultimately had 80% of its military hardware of Soviet origin. It also felt resentment toward the United States, as the US government, despite making assurances to India, had failed to stop Pakistan from using the advanced US weapons, as well as had turned down Indian requests during the war to purchase the same weapons. Pakistan likewise felt betrayed, particularly by the United States, because of their 1954 Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement, and moved even closer to China comprehensively, and in succeeding years had some 50% of its weapons purchases of Chinese origin. Both India and Pakistan claimed victory in the war. However, nearly all independent analysts of the war agree that India had performed the better in strategy and tactics. Pakistan had failed to achieve its aim of inciting a rebellion to allow it to seize the whole of Kashmir. Furthermore, Pakistan held the view that the war could be confined within Kashmir, a strategic oversight since India saw Kashmir as integral territory and its violation could lead to a wider conflict for which Pakistan was disinclined. By contrast, Indian forces had foiled Pakistani objectives on Kashmir, had captured more territory in the course of the war, and by the time of the ceasefire had advanced to within artillery range of Lahore, which it may well have captured had the war continued. India had more military resources at the start of the war, exceeding Pakistani forces by a ratio of nearly 3-1 in numbers of troops and aircraft. However, Pakistani's weapons were more advanced in terms of planes, tanks, and artillery. As well, India had to allocate significant military resources in the east because during the war, China had made many threats to intervene in support of its ally, Pakistan. Only strong pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union had forced China to stand down, and Pakistan likewise declined China's offer to send weapons. After the war, both India and Pakistan increased their military buildup, this arms race putting a severe strain on their economies, and which culminated in another outbreak of war in 1971.